Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Pleased to welcome all of you to our Haddin Forum in the UAB College of Arts and Sciences. I'm David Schwabel, Associate Dean in the college, and it's great to see many familiar faces and some new faces as well. I know a lot of us miss our catered lunch in Heritage Hall, but we will make do here via Zoom. Let me remind you first that our last Haddon Forum of the fall semester will be on November 13th. We'll have Dr. Natalie Todak from the Department of Criminal Justice speaking about her research on body cameras on police officers. So another very timely topic for us to discuss this fall. In the spring, we have two lectures scheduled, both by sociologists. On February 12th, Dr. Miles Moody will be talking about his research on race and discrimination. And then on March 12th, Dr. Magda Slavarsky will be talking about her research on COVID-19 and cultural differences in the pandemic. So let me turn to today's lecture. I think we're in for a real treat. Many of you probably are familiar with our speaker's partner, our provost, Dr. Pam Benoit, but you may know less about her husband, William Benoit, and I can assure you he is worth knowing about, quite a distinguished and accomplished scholar. So Bill earned his bachelor's degree from Ball State University in Indiana, a master's degree from Central Michigan, and then a doctorate in communication from Wayne State. He then served on the faculties at Miami University in Bowling Green in Ohio, moved to University of Missouri, then back to Ohio University, and then came here to UAB to join our faculty in 2017. So I won't tell you exactly how many years Dr. Benoit has served as a faculty member at various universities, but I can tell you this, he has influenced hundreds and hundreds of students. And I think we will enjoy hearing his wisdom ourselves in the way so many students have heard and learned from him over the years. He's also a quite accomplished scholar. He's got a remarkable 20 books published in his name, including something that really struck me, 8 books in the last 8 years. Really something to be thinking about publishing a book every year. On top of that, I stopped counting in his CV, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 225 peer-reviewed journal articles that he's authored. And an H-index, and some of you know what H-index means. He has an H-index of 65, and that means that he's published 65 articles or books that have each been cited at least 65 times. So 65 publications with 65 citations gives you an H-index of 65, which is quite a high number. I would guess there's only a dozen or 20 faculty members at UAB with an H-index at that level. Dr. Benoit's research focuses on how, and I'm reading here from his website, how you can expose or emphasize wrongdoing, and also the image repair of being exposed. So what can be said when you're accused or suspected of wrongdoing? Much of his research is conducted in the very timely context of political elections, how politicians expose and then defend themselves after exposure. So with that said, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. William Benoit, who will present the lecture, The Rise and Fall of Mass Communication. All yours, Bill.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining me via Zoom. Hi. I hope everyone is staying healthy, especially during the COVID pandemic. I don't really care how you vote, but I urge everyone to vote in next year's election. And I want to give a shout out to the Haddin Committee for their work, and I appreciate being selected to talk with you today. I also can't help but give a shout out to my family. This is us on vacation. My wife, Pamela Benoit, excuse me, is Senior Vice President of UAB. My daughter, Jennifer Benoit Bryan, is Vice President of Slover Linnet. I'm not the Vice President of anything. This is the book that I'll be talking about, The Rise and Fall of Mass Communication, by myself and Andrew Billings. And I want to point out that I did the cover art. I'm almost as proud of that as I am of writing the book. It's available on Amazon, and I'm sure you all immediately recognize that this would be a great gift suggestion. Christmas is coming up. People of all ages would love this. Good for Arbor Day. Sadly, we missed Columbus Day, but you can give this book to someone for Columbus Day next year. The way we consider mass communication, it's one message reaches many people. Telephones are not mass communication by our definition because phone calls are usually one-to-one. I had to look it up. The largest conference call ever was less than 17,000 people. Robocalls are mass comm by our definition, but the less said about them, the better. The larger the audience, the greater the potential influence a message has. This is true for sales and advertising. It's true in entertainment, sports, politics, and other contexts. So the reason why mass communication matters is it's a very economical way, very efficient way for one message to reach today millions of people. Two things fueled the growth of mass communication. One was simply population growth. The bigger the population, the larger the potential audience size, the larger the possibility for influence. In 70,000 BC, there were estimates of between 1 and 10,000 human beings. In 1804, the world population rose to 1 billion. Excuse me, today it's estimated at 8 billion. The United States population, I was going to give you a bunch of figures, but I found out that in every census that's ever been taken, the US population increased. And today, the estimate is there's 331 million Americans. Once the current census gets done, I understand the courts allowed the census to stop counting. We may know a little more. The second element that fuels the rise of mass communication is technological advances. Development of paper, this was more than a week ago, enabled one message to reach many people. Still, it could take weeks to make a single copy of a book. Gutenberg's press and movable type enabled many copies to be created of a book, and this invention, this technological advance, revolutionized society. I found a quotation: "The relatively unrestricted circulation of information and revolutionary ideas transcended borders, captured the masses in the Reformation in a move that threatened the power of political and religious authorities. The sharp increase in literacy broke the monopoly of the literate elite on education and learning and bolstered the emerging middle class." So the invention of the printing press and the way it allowed a message to reach many people revolutionized society. Newspapers in American colonies began in, I can't see what year it is because my picture's over it. At first, newspapers mostly were arms of political parties, so they were very partisan. By 1970, 78% of adults read a daily newspaper. Radio and then television provided new ways to reach mass audiences. The first music was broadcast on radio in 1917. Speech was first broadcast in 1921. NBC and CBS began broadcasting TV news in the 1940s. The apex of mass communication came in the 1970s. Viewers had few choices at the time. There was NBC, CBS, ABC, PBS, possibly an independent station. So this new media of television reached many, many people, but consumers had very few choices. NBC, CBS, and ABC sought the same general audience, and this therefore meant that they offered very similar content, nearly identical stories, and sometimes they even used the same video footage. With almost no other options available, in the 60s and 70s, there were no VHS, no DVDs, no cable TV, no satellite TV, and certainly no internet. So these were the choices that you had if you wanted to watch television. And since television had just been invented, this was an exciting media. People wanted to watch television. They were thrilled about having this in their living room. William and Deli Carpini wrote, "For the first time in history, people unknown to each other who met knew what each had in all probability heard or seen the night before. The big speech, the favorite comedy show, Winston Churchill's speech, the contents of the news bulletin. The fact that we were limited to these media for our information and opinions, and the fact that these media sought the same general audience meant that most people had a shared culture. They knew the same things." But then, of course, came the fall of mass communication. Past messages, when it was still a big thing, so to speak, attracted huge audiences. In 1960, the first Nixon-Kennedy debate attracted 37% of the population. President Nixon in 74, when he resigned the presidency, 60% of the people watched that. But in the US population, even though it grew, audiences shrank, both in size and in percent of the population. For example, the first Biden-Trump debate had 22% of the population, far less than the Nixon-Kennedy debate. In 2019, Brett Kavanaugh's Senate testimony was seen by only 6% of the public. Increased media choice fragments audiences. In 1960, if your television was turned on, you watched the Nixon-Kennedy debates. And remember, in 1960, television was very exciting. You had no VCR, no DVD, no satellite TV, no cable TV, no internet, and gasp, no social media. So if your TV was on, you watched the debates and learned about the presidential candidates. As technology progressed, choices in our viewing pleasure increased, and then the choices exploded. The myriad of choices available began to see people in virtual silos. People consume different content, develop different beliefs and attitudes, and this balkanized audiences. For those of you who are not familiar, balkanization is a term first applied to new countries emerging in the Balkan Peninsula. They were often hostile to each other, as some news and social media today are hostile to each other. In 2015 to 2016, instead of attracting most of the public, CBS had a viewership of 2.9%, NBC 2.4%. I'm not going to read all these numbers. A total of 9.5% of the US population watched these networks in 2015 to 2016. That means over 90% of the population got their news from other sources at that time. Well, 90.5 to be exact. Another element of the fall of mass communication is the Fairness Doctrine. In 1949, the FCC created the Fairness Doctrine. This required broadcast television to present contrasting views on controversial issues. In 1987, under President Ronald Reagan, the FCC repealed the Fairness Doctrine. The consequences were seen quickly as Rush Limbaugh's radio show was syndicated in 1988. He is not required to and does not present contrasting views on controversial issues. Unless I seem hostile to him or conservatives, other radio stations and television stations, regardless of their ideological bent, did not have to present contrasting views. In 1996, Fox News was established. It does not matter whether you prefer CNN, Fox, MSNBC, or the One American News Network. Both the content and opinions on these networks differ dramatically. Now, I'm not just going to assert that. I have some evidence. Oh, but before I get to the evidence, this is my attempt to depict what happened with media fragmentation. In the 60s, you had three main networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and a smaller PBS network. Much of what they said overlap. And in fact, if I didn't actually draw this because I'm not that good with PowerPoint, but had I draw it, the overlap would have been much larger, and PBS would have been in the middle because it overlaps with CBS as well. But in any event, as cable satellite TV channels proliferated, as the internet offered myriads of options, and as social media with Facebook pages and Twitter feeds came, we now have today we have hundreds, if not thousands, of information sources that people can visit. And I only labeled a few of them, and there's probably a little more overlap than it shows there. But this is what happened to the mass media. ABC's still there, CBS is still there, NBC's still there, but they're smaller. And by the way, these circles, wait a minute, represent audience size and content. That's not a perfect one-to-one, but the audience for these networks are smaller. The big ones are smaller today than they were. And the content varies. As I said before, in the 60s, CBS, ABC, and NBC sought to find the same audience. So their programming looked very similar. However, today we have a lot of niche programming where new media try to attract just a fragment of the audience, which they can advertise to. And so both the audience size and the content, the audience size is smaller and the content tends to vary more than before. To show that content varies by source, a 2012 study identified whether commentators were giving commentary or opinion or whether they were giving facts. On MSNBC, 85% of the statements were commentary or opinion, only 15% were facts. On Fox News, it was pretty even, 55% commentary opinion, 45% facts. CNN had also a fairly even distribution, a little bit more facts and a little bit less commentary opinion, but both are fairly balanced. But one thing you need to think about that, as we've heard in debates and elsewhere, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. The facts you learn from these ought to be about the same, but you can expect the opinion to vary widely. So whether you watch MSNBC, Fox, CNN, or some other outlet, you're going to get different opinions. Another study looked at the words that were scrolled on screen, cryons, between 2017 and 20, I can't see where that is because of the pictures. The Russia investigation was discussed more on MSNBC than on either of the other networks. Hillary Clinton and the NFL protests were discussed most on Fox. You cannot be influenced by what you do not see. And when you watch a different information source, a different media, you will get different information. Democrats versus Republicans in House and Senate stressed different topics in their tweets. Republicans tweeted earlier and more frequently on COVID-19 than Republicans. Democrats tweeted earlier. Democratic COVID tweets most often discussed health, leave, and testing. Republican COVID-19 tweets most often discussed national unity, China, and business. I take no position on the appropriate response to COVID-19, only that what you watch determines what you know. There's a theory called issue ownership developed by John Petrosik, who says that Republicans and Democrats stress different topics in their TV spots, debates, and speeches. And this theory has been thoroughly confirmed. Republicans usually stress national defense, taxation, foreign policy, and government defense. Democrats usually stress education, healthcare, Social Security, and the environment. This is true even in general election debates. when candidates are asked to discuss the same question. Candidates still emphasize the topics they are associated with, even though they're asked the same questions as their opponents. And when they discuss the same issue, of course, you get different content. Inheritance tax, or is it the death tax? Are you pro-choice or pro-life? So when you follow the Twitter feed, for example, of a Republican or a Democrat, you will be exposed to different information and form different attitudes. Wow, it's 12:20 and I'm on to concluding thoughts. Sorry about that. When different groups of people use different media sources, which offer different information and opinions, audiences become fragmented. Millions live today in what I call virtual information silos. Since people consume conflicting information, and many rely on media that reinforces their attitudes and sharpens the differences between them and another audience. Some people seek out controversial ideas, but many people seek out reinforcing ideas. The idea I'm trying to get across is not that everyone is different from everyone else, or I'm not even trying to say that no people share any information or any opinions. But with the vast proliferation of networks, of web pages, of Twitter feeds, of Facebook pages, which have different content, people develop different information, ideas, and opinions. Balkanized audiences have different beliefs, different values, and different attitudes. As time goes on and audiences continue to fragment, many audiences have less and less in common. Some of you may have heard we had a debate between President Trump and Vice President Biden on September 29th. Then the president fell ill with COVID-19. I'm glad to hear he's doing better. They were scheduled to do a second debate last night, but the Commission for Presidential Debates canceled it. So Vice President Biden decided to have a town hall last night, and then President Trump followed. They were unable to get agreement on having a debate. So on September 29th, the first presidential debate was held. Those who watched this debate saw and heard both candidates' ideas and opinions. I said this is canceled. Yesterday, 2 presidential town halls were held, Biden on ABC and Trump on NBC. Unless you're nuts like me, although I didn't this time, and watched one live and one on YouTube, or unless you tried to switch back and forth between one screen or the other, which I think hardly anyone did. Voters chose one to watch because they were held at the same time. The September 29th debate is a metaphor for the era of mass communication. Both candidates were heard by the audience who tuned in. Last night's dueling town halls are a metaphor for the post-mass communication era. Voters had to choose who to watch, and voters learned different information, heard different ideas, and different opinions. So I think that increased population allowed the mass audience to develop, and the increased fragmentation of the mass media splintered audiences into smaller and smaller groups with different attitudes and opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've got plenty of time for questions, and I think probably the easiest way to do that is for people to type into the chat box any questions you have, and maybe while people are typing, I'll take the honor of having the first question. I think this is a wonderful analysis of the past and the present. I wonder if you can make some attempt to predict where we go in the future. What does mass communication look like in 5 years, in 20 years for that matter?
Well, the premise of our book is that your attitudes are determined, or at least heavily influenced by what information you gain, what opinions you're exposed to. and the cat's out of the bag. The technology's already here. I don't see any reason to expect that we'll go back to mass audiences instead of all these splintered media choices. And I think that Humpty Dumpty broke, and I don't think we can put it back together again. I think we need to be aware of this so we can try to compensate for the balkanization, the splintering of audiences, the different opinions. But there's lots of good evidence that polarization politically has increased. There used to be maybe 30% of the people who'd vote split ticket. Now it's less than 10%. And if you look at the current presidential race, hardly anyone's undecided. And I think that's in large part due to the fact that different groups of people consume different information sources and they hear different ideas. And I don't think technology is going to reverse itself. I think maybe we can have projects that try to educate people on both sides of any issue, but there's a huge change, and it's not going to reverse itself.
Thanks. I see we have several questions. Bill, would you like me to read them out loud, or do you want to read them? How do you want to do that?
Dave, I think I changed my mind, and I'd rather you read them.
Okay, well, I'll get to start at the top. I think there's 4 or 5, but I'll start at the top. A question from Joseph Blaney, who says, Bill, wonderful talk, thanks. I'm wondering if the decline is a problem in the observations. Isn't there as much, if not more, mass media influence, only more dispersed?
Oh, it is. There's still influence from the media, but because the audiences are split into smaller groups, it's harder to observe. There's a very important theory of mass communication, which, Joe, I'm sure you're aware of, agenda setting. And agenda setting says that when you watch the mass media, it influences your attitude about which issues are most important to you. Is it unemployment? Is it immigration? Is it inflation? But that worked, that agenda setting had such a huge effect because people use the same sources. Now you use different sources and they don't all emphasize the same issues. As we saw in the research on CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, when people are exposed to different issues, they won't reach agreement on which issue is the most important.
Good, thanks. The next question is from Chris Brown. He asks, what is the role, if any, of newspapers?
Well, newspapers still have a role, but they have a slightly bigger role because they now have a presence online. But newspapers are just one source among many. I will say New York Times probably has more influence than many others newspapers because it's considered the newspaper of record, and USA Today probably has a little bit larger influence because of its circulation. And you could say the Washington Post, many people, not all, consider it to be reputable. So newspapers are one element in the mix, along with network television, along with local TV stations, along with Twitter feeds, along with Facebook pages.
Good, thanks. The next question is from Pamela Benoit, who says, the country seems very divided currently. Is this a chicken-egg phenomenon? Is the fragmentation of mass media reflecting our culture, or has our culture driven the fragmentation of the media?
I think that the media influences our culture in many ways, subtle and explicit. And when we shared the same mass media in the 60s, we had a shared culture. And now that we have splintered, fragmented, balkanized media, our culture is fragmented. So I think the media allows messages to have their effects on the culture. So I think the media comes first.
Good, thanks. The next question is from Mike Sloan. He asks, what advice can faculty give to students to combat balkanization of their news sources?
I want to hope that if we're aware of this, we will try to seek out a variety of information sources rather than rely on just a few. But I think human nature, as I said, some people seek out conflicting information, but some people tend to seek out reinforcing information. So we have to try to encourage students to widen their horizons.
Great, thanks. These are great questions. I'll keep going. There's several more. From Jonathan Amsbury, there is some evidence that YouTube and other platforms are actually using an algorithm that pushes audience to more extreme content. So is the new media actually more proactive in causing the splintering?
I don't know anything about their algorithms for when they make suggestions to you. But I do think there are some content sources, some media that intend to be extreme. And we used to have we still do, shock jocks who were on radio and they said provocative things, and that increased their base among certain listeners. So I'm sure some media do that. But I think there are other media that try to be, should I say rational? I don't know that I want to say the others are irrational, that try to be more calm and present a more general point of view.
Thanks. The next question is from Kevin Stein. He asks, Bill, how do we get to this place where our news is such a balanced mix between fact and opinion? It used to be mostly fact-based. Is the 24-hour nature of the cycle, or is it the 24-hour nature of the cycle, or does it have something to do with the fragmentation of sources?
Well, there are many factors at work here. One is the fairness doctrine. It used to be because the FCC said the airwaves were public property. You had to present both sides of an issue. They repealed that. So some people may choose to present both conflicting sides of an issue, but you're no longer constrained to do that, and many people choose not to. And people seek out niche audiences that they can advertise to and that they can appeal to with their content. So I think we got that way through mainly technological advances and through the repeal of the fairness doctrine. Good question, Kevin. Who was your PhD advisor?
I'm going to leave that one unanswered. The next question is from Joshua Tobias, who asks, well, first he says, thank you for the great presentation. My question is this: how will mass communication change if the US were to abolish the two-party system and give rise to political factions that are seen in other countries?
Well, I think that it will continue to fragment because people who share political ideology, whether you want to talk about party, Republican, Democrat, or conservative and liberal, they tend to offer some similar content. So if you eliminated that, then the splintering would be even more pronounced. However, I think the Democrats and Republicans would never allow that to happen. I don't think the U.S. would ever eliminate the two-party system. And in fact, they can say, well, there's a Green Party, there's a Libertarian Party, so we don't need to do anything else about this.
Good. The next question is from Will Heath, and he says, what do you say to people who want to get out of their own partisan echo chamber?
I say use a variety of media to get your information about the world. And I try to surf different, sometimes I'll watch CNN, sometimes I'll watch Fox, sometimes I try to use a variety of information sources.
Good. There's one last question written here, and I'll encourage people as we address this last one that there's plenty of time, so feel free to type more questions in if you have them. So this last question is from Jackie, who says, could you speak to the role of media and the move from neutral reporting to biased reporting? What do you see as the long-term effect of this, and do you see it as positive or negative?
I'm not really an expert on reporting per se, but I'll give it a go. I think some people try very hard to be fair and balanced, and I want to give a shout out. I'm sure he's not listening today, to Chris Wallace of Fox News, because I've been impressed with the way he handled it on a network that I think everyone agrees has a preference. So it has a lot to do with the journalist's individual philosophy and how they go about things. But it used to be that news was not considered a profit center for network back in the 60s and into the 70s. And so they didn't really care what they say. But now news is considered a for-profit part of the media, and they want to gain an audience that they can sell to advertise, they being the media, not so much the journalists. But the journalists, you know, are hired and given guidance by the media executives. So I think that some are going to have a more homogeneous viewpoint and some a more heterogeneous viewpoint. And I don't see that as changing in the near term.
Good, thanks. So there's several comments that I think summarize us well. Joe Bellini said, I believe Bill has earned a nice dinner out at his favorite German restaurant. I will, I will second that. There's several comments thanking you and saying great presentation. We do have one new question that came in from Catherine Danilou. Is the same seen in other countries where there are often less channels and often an official government channel, or even where the media is muzzled, for example, Twitter?
I don't think that the balkanization that I've talked about here happens to the same extent in every country. And you're absolutely right. There are some countries that have a state-sponsored media, and there are countries that have restrictions. I'm not an expert on communication regulations in other countries, but for example, I do know that in many countries, you're limited about when you run political ads. There's only a certain time you're allowed to run a political ad. And I'm sure there are limitations on commercial media. The more limitations there are, the less control the media has over its own content, the less balkanization is likely to occur.
Good, thanks. We have a few more questions have come in from Jen Benoit Bryan. She asked, can you imagine a scenario in which this trend away from concentrated mass communication reverses? What might that look like?
I could hope for a time when there's less balkanization, but I mean, there are so many factors that work together to do this. One is that, as I said, people tend to seek out information that reinforces their own opinions. Not everyone does that, but many people do. And with this age of targeted marketing and advertising, those networks that rely on advertising for their revenue have an incentive to seek out a particular niche audience, and they need to offer content that attracts that audience. So I hope we get back to less balkanization of media, but I just don't see it as likely. I'm sad about that.
Thanks. I'm going to skip because it continues the same theme, and then I'll go backwards to the other question. But the next one I'll read is from Pam Benoit, who says, but aren't there also advantages to the balkanization? Can you comment on those?
My wife mentioned to me that the explosion of the internet and social media has provided a voice for many groups that did not have any voice before. I think that's an important function. And I believe a lot in self-expression. But one of the things that you have to overcome is social media is self-selected. You have to attract an audience. Well, television audiences are self-selected too. You have to get people to join your Twitter feed or visit your Facebook page. So there's a greater opportunity now for smaller groups that are less well represented to get a message out. And that's a good thing.
Great, and that's a nice segue to the question, a few up that from Yogesh Vora, who asked, what do you see as mass communication moving forward as more digital natives dominate as consumers?
Can I say I don't know? I mean, I think technology is going to continue to advance, and that's going to have changes we can't foresee because we don't know what those advances will be like. But it's clear that things are not going to stay the way they are. Wow, that was not very profound, but that's what I had.
That's fine. Jonathan Emsbury is chiming in here. He wrote, are we possibly in a parallel to the early 1900s when printing presses got cheap and there were hundreds of papers, meaning newspapers, in most big cities? So might this be a transition trend?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things about newspapers is um, it took a while before the Associated Press and the United Press International began to submit stories on wire, which I think back then might have been telegraph. I'm not sure about that. But most newspapers only provided content in their area. There weren't national news stories, there weren't national news sources. And I think I mentioned before, many newspapers were funded by political parties in the 1800s. And so obviously they had a different slant, and a different newspaper sponsored by a different party would have a different slant. So, then there was no New York Times yet, or at least certainly not one with a circulation like that. There was no USA Today. There were hundreds of small newspapers that were focused on the area in which the newspaper was published. And they were very fragmented.
Great, thanks. I think I have covered all of the questions. If I missed yours, please do prompt me, but I think I've read all the questions here. And I think this was a really terrific intellectual exchange, really kind of the epitome of Haddin Forum, to have this interdisciplinary intellectual exchange, and of course, a very timely topic.
Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate your attention. And vote.
Good. Let's end on that note. Vote, and thanks to Dr. Benoit. A round of applause virtually. And please do join us again on November 13th to hear Dr. Todak speak about her work in police officers and body cameras. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David, for everything you've done.
Well done. This was terrific. I appreciate it. And I will log off now, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks.
You're welcome.